Hi, I'm Leslie Vernick, and I'm the author of the new book, The Emotionally Destructive Marriage: How to Find Your Voice and Reclaim Your Hope. Last week I talked about safety being the number one priority in healing a destructive marriage. You know, words of remorse and tears of apology are never enough when there have been repetitive actions and attitudes of abuse, deceit, and indifference. When we're in those situations, we want to see a change of heart as well as a change of habit. We want to see someone putting off old behaviors and learning to put on new ones, as Paul talks about in Ephesians. Along with safety, we also have to learn sanity. In other words, we need to learn how to think truthfully. And for a long time in a destructive marriage, both the husband and wife have believed lies. Oftentimes, a woman in a destructive marriage has believed a lie that it's her responsibility to fix everything, to make it better. She's been told if only she were more loving or more godly or more submissive, then her husband would change. And so she's believed that lie, and she's worked really hard to try to make things better. Yet things have not gotten better. Jesus is our example of that if we want to refute that kind of thinking, because Jesus was godly. He was loving, and he was appropriately submissive. And yet certain people, such as the Pharisees and the religious leaders, never did change. You know, thinking truthfully as well as living truthfully are high values to God. Paul tells us that the more we live in pretend land or placate people, we live in fantasy world or deny reality, we are self-deceived or we deceive others, he tells us in Romans 1 that our mind becomes more and more depraved, insane, and destructive. And so before you can work on solving serious marital problems, these lies that we believe, these deep-rooted underlying beliefs, must be uprooted and refuted. And this is done usually in individual counseling, not in marital work. Because if these lies are not recognized and challenged and even changed, they continue to form the very foundation of an individual's thinking and problem-solving strategies. And therefore, there's no possibility of real change in working together to build a healthy relationship if those lies aren't changed and refuted and brought out into the open. Because there's no safety to talk, to question, to disagree, and to hold one another accountable for the commitments that they've made to the marriage. The Bible says that one of the main things that every one of us has to do in order to grow as a Christian is that we need to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And therefore, both a husband and a wife in a destructive marriage must separately as well as together be committed to truth-seeking as well as truth-telling. For example, let's look at some of the sanity needs of a destructive husband. Because first, he must be willing to re-examine some of his unrealistic expectations of his wife and of marriage, and his underlying attitudes of entitlement. He must come to understand that there is no perfect wife or fantasy wife, and he also has to value his wife as a separate person and not as an object, because she has her own thoughts, her own feelings, and her own needs. And she's a sinner too, and she won't be able to meet his every need whenever he wants all of the time. He needs to recognize the lies he tells himself when he believes he's entitled to the blessings of a warm and loving wife, no matter how bad he treats her. Sanity means that he accepts that God puts his law of consequences in place. And when you're deceitful and indifferent and abusive and controlling, there are definitely negative consequences in the marriage. And forgiveness does not entitle someone to automatic restoration with no consequences, no amends, or no work. Sanity means that you learn to take responsibility for your own thoughts and your own behaviors without blaming other people. Sanity means that you learn to handle your negative emotions, such as disappointment, frustration, anger, and hurt in new ways that don't damage people or your relationships. And you learn that if you want to have a good relationship with someone, you now understand that you need to take some responsibility for that to happen so that it doesn't continue to deteriorate and get destroyed. Once the destructive spouse, or even the enabling and compliant spouse, has completed the sanity stage, then the couple is together ready to work on some deeper issues, because this provides the proper foundation in which they can build a new history together. In summary, to work through the sanity stage with a destructive individual means that he moves through the 5 steps of change. Let me outline them for you. First, clarity. He sees that he's been destructive, abusive, indifferent, deceitful, or controlling toward his spouse, and he no longer wants to behave in those ways. Second, he's committed. He's willing to be accountable, teachable, in order to grow and become the man that he wants to become. If there is any question of safety, he will immediately call his supportive community and temporarily, if necessary, remove himself from the situation or even the home. Third, he will invite a loving community to help him. He will allow others, including his wife, to speak into his life, and he will listen and prayerfully consider what the community has to say about what they observe in his attitudes and his behaviors. Fourth, he will practice confession. He will own his own wrongdoing instead of blaming, rationalizing, minimizing it, and he'll confess his sin to God as well as to the person he's hurt or offended. And if he engages in abusive tactics, such as verbal bullying, intimidation, withdrawing for long periods of time, or engages in other behaviors that frighten his spouse, he understands that restoration of the marriage at this time is not possible. And lastly, he humbly accepts the consequences of his sin, and he makes restitution where necessary in order to repair the relationship. Sanity and safety. These are the two foundational pillars that must be worked on before a couple can successfully navigate the healing stages of marriage. And if these steps have not been taken, and the husband is not in agreement about the 5 steps of change, marital counseling will never solve the deeper root issues involved. Next week, I want to talk about what it takes, once these two foundational pillars are in place, to begin to build new history together. God bless.